This video is for Chapter 2 of your gender textbook. Chapter 2 is entitled Ideas, and it introduces the concept of the binary as well as gender ideology. In addition, I will be introducing the concepts of hegemonic masculinity and emphasize femininity when we talk about gender expression. To get us started, and this is an activity that I often do in my in-person classes, but if you haven't already done so, jot down 5 personality traits that you think best describe you. So would you describe yourself as kind or brave or conscientious or creative or generous or you get my point. Loyal, right? Just think about the kind of personality characteristics that you use to describe yourself and just jot it down somewhere. I promise that I will come back to this thought exercise later in this lecture video to illustrate a point. To begin us thinking about this concept of ideas and the idea of there being a gender binary, that we are two distinct genders with non-overlapping traits and characteristics, right? That there is this high level of differentiation that exists between the sexes. I want to give 3 examples, and I'm going to be honest, I did not think of these examples on my own. In previous semesters, there was a small little reader that used to be included as a bundle with the first edition of your textbook. And I used to assign it in my classes and some of the readings that went along with the textbook. The reader is no longer in print, and it's fairly scarce and hard to find. So that's why I'm not assigning it, this semester. But in the reader, in order to introduce this part, the introduction to ideas, these were the examples that they gave. And so I still think they're very good examples and things to think about. So example 1, they said, they were talking about what they call shiny armpits in the apocalypse. And they gave the tagline, just because you live in fear for your life doesn't mean you let yourselves go, ladies. And explicitly, they call out some of the characters on the TV show The Walking Dead, a TV show that I must admit I'm a big fan of. But after I read this reading, now whenever I watch it, I am thinking about this, right? In an apocalypse, the fact that, you see people there with their hairless upper lips and their perfectly tweezed brows, and maybe most importantly, their armpits. And Rosita in this case is also for some reason rocking a crop top, where we also see that she has a very smooth belly. All of this is perpetuating this idea that women are naturally hairless. And anyone who is a woman or has a sister or a partner or a friend that they've lived with, or maybe even their mother, knows that this isn't the case, that for the vast majority of women, that perception of hairlessness is supported by tweezing and waxing and shaving, and even electrolysis requires multiple treatments. And it takes a lot of time, and it's time consuming, and it requires products, and it raises the question, would anyone necessarily not only have access to those products, but would that be a priority? Would that be how you are spending your time in the apocalypse? So when they still present these supposedly dystopian movies and TV shows, and these shows where the whole world is melting down and undergoing like a massive just kind of decline into anarchy, whether it's caused by zombies or whatever. The fact that they still feature these women that are hairless and without body hair, it's like, why? Like, would that really be the case? And by putting it out there as the case, what message are we sending? The second example the reading would give would be the history of Tom Cruise and his leading ladies. For people who don't know, and I know Tom Cruise isn't quite the same level of movie star for most of you all the way he was when I was growing up. But Tom Cruise is short. He is known to be short. Just how short he is up for debate. But that frequently means that a lot of his female co-stars and leading ladies are taller than him. And there are a variety of tactics in terms of how they frame the shots in his movies, as well as sometimes he's been in movies where he's worn lifts, which is basically like male heels, platforms. How he used to position himself when he would be photographed with his much taller ex-wives, Nicole Kidman and Katie Holmes, or Nicole Kidman was significantly taller. Katie Holmes was also a little taller. Oftentimes they would be on a step, one or two below him. All of this, of course, was to continue to give off that perception that, especially in movies where he was being presented as the hero and the leading man, right? It's this idea that in order to be manly, you have to be tall. In order to save the girl, she needs to be shorter than you, because of this association that we have with, masculinity and height and power and dominance. And how, as opposed to turning that dominant message on its head and being like, hey, Tom Cruise is all of those things. He's dominant, he's masculine, he's still the hero, but hey, he just so happens to be shorter than his leading lady. Instead of them just embracing that message, why instead they would go through all these tactics to, make it seem like what was commonly known, Tom Cruise is short, was in fact not known in movie world. And the final example is when in MMA, and that oftentimes the one hard and fast rule in a very violent sport where almost anything goes is no hitting below the belt. And, that part of the reading is especially interesting because, they present that as if this is just, a protection for men. But it's the same sport where, despite all that we know about concussions and CTE, we allow multiple blows to the head. So for some reason, why would we be more concerned about protecting men's genitals than their brains? And the authors of this particular reading say what it's really protecting about men is the idea, of course, that these, strong, manly men that are engaging in this voluntary violence, right, that they're tough, that they're invincible. And that if we allowed crotch shots, and if, I grew up with brothers and, so if you've ever hit a guy in that area, or if you're a guy and you've been hit in that area, that oftentimes it becomes a great equalizer, right? No matter how tough or dominant you are, you're not very tough and dominant when you're clutching at your groin and you go down really quickly. And the argument just being that no hitting below the belt rule isn't really so much about safety, but about protecting that image of that very specific image of kind of dominant, toughness in regards to MMA fighters and their masculinity. And so, all three of these examples, what they have in common is how media helps perpetuate this very kind of dominant definition of what is masculinity and what is femininity, and that these examples all contribute to the gender binary. Women can't be hairy in the apocalypse because men are hairy. Tom Cruise can't just be a short leading, action hero because we associate shortness with women, and not with men, especially leading, the hero of the story. And then finally, that MMA in particular, which is kind of built on this image of toughness and violence, that hitting below the belt would quickly reveal that, even the toughest guy, that there's, a pretty much a go-to method of kind of bringing the toughest guy to his knees, literally. And so all of these examples, this idea really is opening up this question about, to what extent does this sex gender differentiation exist? Because commonly how people think about it and talk about it is that we're very different, and thus we are two sexes. And once again, it is this binary system. You're either XX or XY. You're either masculine or you're feminine. You're a man or you're a woman. You're a male body or female body. But it goes beyond just it being two. But for some people, their arguments is that it's not even just that we're different, but we are totally different. And one kind of popular author who kind of built on this idea of total difference is John Gray, who had the very popular book back in the day, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, right? It was the idea, and he would speak in his book about Martians, i.e. men, and Venetians, i.e. women. He'd speak about us as if we were two different species. And so the authors address this very early on in the chapter, by asking the question, are we opposite sexes? And, they first of all, they establish that this idea that we're opposite sexes is a fairly newer concept, because historically, males and females were seen as being the same sex, but women were seen as being the inferior version, right? And they give the quote that they used to think that women were just men inside out, right? But to the same thing that, the scrotum was made of, the vagina was made of, it was just internal. And of course, we now know that to be true as well. But the authors, their stance is, no, men and women are not the exact same. Women are not just inferior versions of the male body. But at the same time, we are not so different that we should be described as being the opposite sex. That there is not the evidence, the authors, state for that statement to be supported either. But oftentimes this is how we think of ourselves, right? We think of, that's what men do, or that's boys being boys, or, of course that she feels that way. She's a woman, right? We speak about ourselves in this binary term, as if by knowing your sex, we know your gender, and therefore we know everything it is about you, because males are so different from females, men are so different from women. And really a big part of this chapter is pushing back on this idea of the perfect binary. And they begin that pushing back, that complication of the binary, by addressing sex. Because even more so than gender, we really we're taught that sex is binary, right? You're born and you're XX, you're a girl, you're XY, you're a boy. And, and you get your X's from, your mom and your mother's eggs, and you get either an X or a Y from your father's sperm, and that's what determines your maleness and females. And we treat it like it is a perfect binary, but it is not. And so this is something that I introduced in the first chapter, but coming back to the fact that we have individuals in our society that are intersex. Meaning that perfect binary, whether it's on the chromosomal level, or which is, XXXY, whether it's on the hormonal level, where people have, women generally have kind of one, or, kind of their own kind of unique combination of sex hormones, and men have their own different, unique combination of sex hormones. But people do not always fit those models. Then, we can talk about it in terms of genitalia, where, in terms of our sex organs, we think about women having uteruses and fallopian tubes and ovaries and vaginas, and men, of course, having testes and penises and so forth. But people who are intersex are people who deviate from that kind of binary norm. And they make up roughly 0.01% to 0.02% of the population. And there are a range of conditions that we would consider to be intersex. And some of them are immediately noticeable at birth. And some do not become noticeable until puberty. and some do not become noticeable for some women in particular until much later in life when they are perhaps trying to conceive. And so we don't talk about people being intersex, right? We don't talk about that being a third legitimate option. You finally have some states in the United States, and then there are some countries that now allow for a third option on birth certificates. But previously, how we used to treat and reinforce sex as being binary is that especially people that were identified as being intersex at birth, parents were oftentimes strongly encouraged, and in some cases, you might even want to use the words coerced, into choosing a sex for their child. And now, of course, we know that that kind of lack of bodily autonomy is really harmful. And there are laws that even in most states now protect against parents making that choice for their infants, allowing people to make that decision as an adult, if they want to identify, and particularly if they want to have, affirmation surgery, so that specifically in this case, so their genitalia presents as being non-deviant from that expected male and female bodiness. There is the Interface Project, which puts a public face on people with intersex bodies, because as I stated in the first video, that 0.01%, 0.02% is actually a whole lot of people if you think about all the people that exist in the world. And kind of the cute way to remember it is roughly the same percentage of the population globally who are natural redheads. So I like to tell some people, if you know a natural redhead or two, then whether you realize it or not, statistically speaking, you probably know someone who's intersex. I give you two clips from longer documentaries, and by all means, if you have the time to watch either documentary, Intersection or Gender Revolution, particularly Gender Revolution, it has a lot of things relevant to our course. But I give you two clips about how our acknowledgement that intersex people exist and the move we've done away from forcing people who are intersex to choose, right? They can choose, but like I said, we're now allowing individuals to do that for themselves instead of the expectation that their parents should make that decision for them. But in some cases, we're also respecting the fact that some people are rejecting the binary, that they're saying, hey, I was born intersex, and that's what I am. That's what I'm going to claim myself to be. Not male or female. And if your mind is still just kind of like blown, like you're really confused about how people can be intersex, and especially if you are maybe confusing or conflating it with transgender or gender fluidity or gender queerness, I strongly suggest that you take a nice long look at the steps towards becoming a man or a woman in the United States, that table 2.1, because up until you get to gender identity and gender expression, the last steps on the table, everything else are things that we think of as being biological, that maybe we've been taught that these biological aspects are inherently binary. But it's worth noting that there are many people who deviate from this kind of binary normative kind of path, as your book describes it. And this happens at each step. So your book talks in good detail about how people can deviate from that XY, XX chromosomal path. How if you're talking in terms of like gonads or external or internal genitalia, people can be missing one. They can have, genitalia internally that we would expect from both males and females. Particularly for males, external genitalia. If a person's, there is a measurement by which a penis has to be a certain length in order to be considered a penis, to be classified such as at birth. as opposed to it just then being labeled like a undistinguishable genitalia. There's the secondary sex characteristics that, for some people, this is when they realize they're intersex, when things do not necessarily come in, menstrual cycles don't happen, and secondary sex characteristics don't develop. And all of this, of course, is still talking about sex. We are not even necessarily talking about gender. So before we even move to talking about gender, it's just worth noting the binary is complicated even in terms of sex, that the 0.01, 0.02%, they have frequently been treated by the medical professionals as if they are mutations and anomalies. But when it is that large of a proportion, consistently that larger proportion of the population, it does raise the question, is it really their bodies that are the issue, or the kind of binary system that we have created to classify their bodies?